So up to this point, we have seen through the history from early epidemic how observation of diseases were taking place, and from the work of Hippocrates and Castro. So in modern times, and maybe the age of Enlightenment, more discovery and observations have led to intervention and care of the patients. Selected major historical marker in infectious diseases are as listed in this table. For example, discovery of vaccination by Jenner, the observation of epidemic of measles on Faroe Islands by Panam, and measure against childbed fever by Simon Weiss, and the classic cholera epidemic in London by Snow, germ theory by Pasteur, and so on and so forth. One of the greatest contribution to the public health movement was the introduction of effective measure against smallpox towards the end of the 18th century. Smallpox was the primary cause of childhood death, and it was estimated to kill approximately 400,000 annually, with mortality rates of 25 to 40%, as high as 40%. And survivors are often left disfigured and blinded due to the lesions. In 1700s, the West adopted this method of protection against smallpox, but it has been recognized and practiced in ancient China for many centuries. In 1721, Lady Mary Montagu introduced variolation to England. It is the inoculation of material from the true smallpox pustules, which produced a milder attack, than the spontaneous infection, thus giving protection to future attacks of smallpox. But actually, variolation is a dangerous method. So Edward Jenner was interested in finding a better and a safer approach to preventing smallpox. Based on his observation that milkmaids were immune to smallpox because they already had cowpox, he was convinced that cowpox could protect against smallpox. And to stress that these were purely from the observation and they were not based on any scientific study. Okay. So Jenner became convinced and decided to perform the first vaccine clinical trial ever recorded in human history in 1796 by inoculating this 8-year-old James Phillips with the material, the pustules, that was recovered from the hand of the milkmaid who had cowpox. So later, 6 weeks later, he wanted to confirm and to prove whether his experiment was indeed effective. He later injected the actual material of smallpox into the boy 6 weeks later. And he proved that the boy was later immune to smallpox. This experiment gave rise to the birth of science of vaccination, and Jenner also coined the term vaccine from vacca in Latin, which means cow. As we can see, this discovery is incalculable has incalculable benefit to mankind, and it led to eventually smallpox eradication 180 years later. Another milestone in infectious disease epidemiology was Panem, expanding on the concept of careful observations of individuals. Peter Panem, a Danish physician, at the age of 26, a newly graduated, a very brilliant physician. He was designated by the government to the Faroe Island and to investigate the outbreak of the measles, which has subsided in Faroe for 65 years. So Panem's clinical observation provided the first accurate account of the natural history of measles, that the disease is passed on from person to person. Hence, he denied the belief of the miasma theory. Also, Panem took the advantage of the fact that the island was isolated. So he studied the transmission of the diseases. He observed that the measles rash appeared approximately 14 days after the person is exposed to the infective matter. Thus, he described the concept of incubation period with his observation. Also, the observation that no one of age above 65, if you remember, I mentioned that there was an outbreak 65 years ago. No one of age over 65 developed disease during his observation, and that the attack rate of those aged under 65 was as high as 97%. So he described with his observation that there's an age difference with the attack rate of measles, and also that if you survive this infection, it would provide you a lifelong immunity. So also, as he wrote in his report, proposing the concept of lifelong immunity in his observation. Yet another significant example of observation and intervention. In early 19th century, childbed fever was a common cause of death among women following childbirth, with mortality rates as high as 25%. And many theories of what causes the childbed fever were popular at that time, such as the atmospheric toxin, as we have heard throughout the course, the miasma, or even the solar or magnetic influences. So this period, there was the growing interest in pathologic anatomy. And because the cause of childbed fever remained unknown, great interest was also in findings the answer through performing autopsy in women who died of the diseases. So Simon Weiss is a Hungarian physician who was the pioneer in these sterile surgical practices. As shown in this figure, that shows the mortality rates in the first and the second division of the Department of Obstetrics in Vienna, lying in hospital between 1839 to 1849. Simon Weiss was appointed to the first division in 1846. The first division had only medical students and physicians, while the second division, as shown in a dotted line, had majorly midwives in their division. So he shows from after his appointment from the retrospective records. He showed from the retrospective medical records that it is in fact the hand of the medical students and the physicians that may be carrying the cause of childbed fever. Because they went to autopsy room, coming back without washing their hand and assisting delivery to women in the first division. So he performed the first experiment by introducing an intervention. He asked the medical students and the physician to wash their hands and to also brush their nails to remove the dermis before returning to the obstetric ward in the hospital. So subsequently, after this intervention by Semmelweis, for the first time in 10 years, the mortality rate in the first division was in fact becoming lower than the second division. But unfortunately, due to his way too liberal political views and the fact that the bacteria was not identified, his theories were not so welcome by the medical professions, and that resulted him in leaving the hospital in 1849.